I was in Afghanistan during the Civil War, and it was a very, very, very bloody affair. Kabul was destroyed by the Afghans, not by the Soviets. Militias were fighting street to street, block to block. It was like Mogadishu. In Kabul today, you can go out and have fun. I mean, this is one of the sort of maybe less well understood facts, is that Afghanistan is basically pretty safe. And let me just lay out the numbers for you. You're more likely to be killed in Iraq today than you are to be killed in Afghanistan. Last year, 4,000 Iraqis were killed, population of Iraq, 25 million approximately. Last year in Afghanistan, about 3,000 plus Afghan civilians were killed in the war, population around 30 million. In fact, you're more likely to be murdered in my hometown now of Washington, D.C., than you are to be killed in the Afghan war, which is not to say that it isn't a relatively serious problem. The point is that there's a misunderstanding. Because it's sort of framed in the same frame as Iraq, people tend to think of this as violent as Iraq was, which it simply isn't. And there was a very interesting poll that recently conducted by the Asia Foundation. The kind of classic polling question is your country going in the right direction? Now, when I checked just before the US election, in a Rasmussen poll, 37% of Americans said the country's going in the right direction. In the Asia Foundation poll, 52% of Afghans said their country's going in the right direction. And there are problems with polling in Afghanistan. It's a conflict zone and all that. But those caveats aside, Afghans have a sense that what is happening now is better than a lot of things they've lived through. The Soviet invasion, where a million Afghans were killed, a third of the population was forced out of their homes. The Civil War, in which hundreds of thousands more people were killed. The Taliban, which brought peace but at a huge price. And there have been substantially a lot of good changes that we've seen. We know all the bad things that have happened, but there are many good things. I mean, just most obviously, millions of kids in schools, sort of an economy. The World Bank stopped measuring the Afghan economy during the Taliban era because there was nothing to measure. Now there's obviously it's an aid economy, it's a drug economy, but Afghans are naturally entrepreneurial. And there is, one in three of them now have cell phones. There was no telephone system at all under the Taliban. I could give you a whole series of indicators that life is sort of better. I just wanted to quickly address, I think, 5 or 6 quite common myths about what's going on in Afghanistan. The first myth, a very common one, is the graveyard of empires. This needs to be put in the sort of graveyard of cliches. It's no longer, clearly the United States and its allies are not being defeated in Afghanistan. The Soviet occupation was a very, very different matter. Levels of violence, I think, I've already sort of dealt with. They're much lower than people believe. Another kind of common belief is that Afghanistan isn't really a genuine nation. It's just a bunch of warring tribes that happen to be in one country. Now, not even the Taliban is talking about sort of despite the title of our book, a Talibanistan or a sort of independent Pashtunistan. Everybody in Afghanistan has a very strong sense of Afghan nationhood, and there's a very good reason for that. The modern Afghan state has been around since 1747, which makes it older than the United States. Another common view is there's no model for a sort of successful Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan in the 1970s was a tourist destination. It was at peace with itself and its neighbors. So I think there is a model for a peaceful Afghanistan. Afghans, I think generally speaking, they're very worried about 2014. They haven't absorbed the fact that the international community isn't sort of abandoning them as was happened in the past. The United States closed its embassy there in 1989, something most Americans have forgotten about, but is very on the minds of many Afghans. And I think just go back to the idea of would there be another renewed civil war? I think there's so many differences. Feckless as the Afghan National Army may be and the Afghan police, they are quite large, 350,000. You do have 40 countries involved. I think now, once the United States signals that it's going to keep 10,000 soldiers for a protracted period in Afghanistan post-2014, other countries will want to be part of that in some shape or form. International attention, the attention of the international media, all that makes the post-2014 Afghanistan look very different than the Afghanistan that I recall visiting in the early mid-90s.